Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's second Saturday. This program is going to be all about the Spanish history of blacksmithing. My name is Aaron Gardner. I'm the site manager here at Casa San Ysidro. Casa is a satellite location of the Albuquerque Museum. We are a historic house museum that gives public tours and provides public programming. So Herreros, or blacksmiths, were extremely valued members of Spanish expeditions to New Mexico. Initially, these blacksmiths were responsible for shoeing horses and repairing gear. And as more colonists arrived in New Mexico, blacksmiths turned to making domestic goods for the people. So Dave Sabo is a contemporary blacksmith and artist with a deep knowledge of Spanish colonial blacksmithing. Dave is a New Mexico native. He was born and raised in and around Albuquerque. He is also the son of the prolific Southwestern painter and sculptor Betty Sabo. So Dave follows in a tradition of family artists. He utilizes a forge, anvil, and hammer, along with techniques developed by early blacksmiths to create original art, combining stone, iron, and glass or wood. He is the past vice president of the Southwest Artist Blacksmith Association, and you can see his work at the Chumani Gallery in Madrid, New Mexico, and occasionally at events at Casa San Ysidro and in the Village. Consistently, you can see his work demonstrated through Blacksmithing Basics, a continuing education UNM program. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dave.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's see.
Can you hear everything?
I can't hear anything.
Oh, okay. Here we go. How about now?
Yeah.
No. All right.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. What I'm going to do is give you a kind of a high-level discussion about what blacksmithing was in New Mexico. Actually, what I'm going to do, though, is go through some of the history of Spanish colonial exploration and expeditions into the Southwest, starting from when right after Columbus discovered the New World. I wanted to give you a little bit of background. I'm a retired federal employee. I've always worked with iron and metal throughout my career, just as a hobby, more of a avocation than a real vocation. And once I was able to retire, I was able to actually set up a shop and begin doing the type of work that I'm doing now. And I've been doing that for, well, probably about 10 years. What I am is a kind of a mediocre blacksmith. I'm not a master by any means, but I'm able to persevere in terms of being able to develop my techniques so that I can use them in my art. The other thing that I'm not is an historian. I do have a deep interest in New Mexico and in all things New Mexico. And I have spent time studying and reading about the Spanish explorations in New Mexico. So as I say, what I'm going to do, though, is a fairly high-level overview of what went on with the exploration in New Mexico, and then what it led up to through various periods in our history. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do a demonstration today. It's so sad what's happened here at Casa San Ysidro with the flooding, but they're getting it all straightened out. And so I'm really quite happy about that because I love this place. I'm so happy to have been able to work here for the past 4 or 5 years doing my blacksmithing demonstrations. In the future, when we get back to being able to actually do work here, and any of you want to come by when we have those special occasions that I'm working, please stop by and ask questions at that time. Also, you can ask questions anytime during this demonstration or my discussion. And I would really rather you do that rather than holding off until the end. So don't hesitate to stop me if you have any questions. So let me go through a little bit of what we're going to talk about, and want to kind of discuss the blacksmith's role in the exploration and settlement of New Mexico, give you kind of a background on the importance of blacksmiths, what a blacksmith really is, and talk a little bit about the challenges and the hardships for the colonies as they were being developed. So we're going to go through and talk about the tools of the colonial blacksmith, the history of iron, the Iron Age, the development of iron processes in Europe, and then the development of high quality steel, which led to the development by Toledo, Spain, of its fine high quality steel back in the 15th and 16th centuries. Is that making sense to you?
Oh, yeah.
We'll also talk about the Spanish colonization, the dates, some of the leaders. I'm not going to go into a lot of the detail on all of the different explorations. I'll probably just hit on a few of the really more important colonial explorers. And then we'll talk a little bit about what happened with the impacts to the Native Americans, servitude and slavery, the Pueblo Revolt, when the Native Americans finally got fed up with the Spanish treatments, and then what happened in the post-revolt period. So let's go ahead and move into that. So what's a blacksmith? Let me talk a little bit about that because it's kind of interesting. You know, there's an old story that's always told by blacksmiths that talks about Camelot. And when King Arthur was constructing Camelot, he obviously hired a whole lot of specialists who did various kinds of work. And so when it was all completed, he decided he was going to have a big dinner at his round table and celebrate with all of the different specialty craftsmen that had worked for him. And so he wanted the one that everybody felt was the most valuable to sit next to him. So first he turned to the blacksmith and he asked the blacksmith, "What did you do?" And the blacksmith said, "Well, Your Highness, I really didn't do much. I made the hinges and doorknobs, and I made nails for the, to put things up, but just things like that, making rods for hanging curtains." And the King Arthur said, "Well, thank you very much. That's good." So then he turned to the stone cutter and mason and he said, "What did you do?" And he said, "Well, I cut all the stones for the castle. I built all the walls. I put everything together. There wouldn't be a Camelot if it weren't for me." And the king said, well, where did you get your tools?" And the mason looked at him and he said, "Well, I got it from the blacksmith." And then he said, "Well, that's good." So then he turned to the woodworker and he said, "What did you do?" And he said, "Well, Your Highness, I made all your shelves. I made all the cupboards. I made all the doors. I did all of the things that, made separation for each of the rooms." And King Arthur said, "Well, that's fine. Where did you get your tools?" And he said, "Well, the blacksmith made them." So then he turned to the cook and he said, well, what did you do? He said, well, I fed everyone. If it hadn't been for me, nothing would have happened. And so the King Arthur said, well, where did you get your knives and forks? And where did you get your pots and pans? And he said, well, the blacksmith made them. And so he went around further on, talked to others, and he said, finally at the end, he said, would any of you disagree with me that if it weren't for the blacksmith, we could have never done any of this? And so, it's a strange little story, but it really does lend itself to what we're going to talk about here and the importance of what goes on with a blacksmith. And then I'm sure that all of you have heard Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem, The Village Blacksmith. And it's under a spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. The smith, a mighty man is he, with large and sinewy hands and muscles of his brawny arms as strong as iron bands. His hair is crisp and black and long, his face is like the tan. His brow is wet with honest sweat, he earns whate'er he can. And looks the whole world in the face, for he owes not any man. I'm not going to read the whole poem, but it's long, and it's always interesting because I like to go back to that. And then you got to remember too that the last name Smith is the most common name in the United States, and it is throughout the world. There's that type of a name in every country, in every language. And the reason is that a village couldn't exist without a blacksmith. You go back and look at the development of the small communities throughout the world. Every one of them had to have a blacksmith because nothing could be constructed until you had somebody that could work the iron that was necessary for the development of a community. I read a while back about Luckenbach, Texas, where they built the community and they built the town, and then after 5 years they were finally able to get a blacksmith to move there, and it helped develop the whole town. So that's really what we're talking about here is when you think about New Mexico and the importance of the small communities, you really are talking about the development of everything that goes on in the state based on the blacksmith's ability to meet whatever was needed. Not change anything? Okay. Even New Mexico, up until, even after the Great Depression, New Mexico still was heavily dependent on the blacksmiths. And for example, down in Corona, I stopped by and was talking to a gentleman there, and turned out that his father was the blacksmith in Corona until 1945. And when he was finally able to retire, but at that time, they were finally able to start shipping goods in from other places, things like nails and hinges and door handles and things like that. There's even still a blacksmith in Magdalena, New Mexico right now, who still fixes people's tools and does things for them. So it's an important occupation, one that is really important to a community. Now, with regard to the Spanish blacksmiths, I'll give you a little bit of background on that. The Spanish set up guilds and societies for the protection of quality. Does anybody have any question? Okay. So the way the guilds were set up, and this is really true in all of Europe, they were sort of self-governing organizations. They were established to enforce rules for the production and quality of sales goods. The municipalities, wherever they were, they wanted to have the guilds because the guilds made sure of the quality and that there wasn't people overcharging or gouging for the production of anything. And it wasn't just with blacksmiths, this was true of any specialized type of craftsman. And so they basically follow the same type of hierarchy. That is where you have a master, a journeyman, and obviously when you start talking about that, the apprentice was primarily someone who was an indentured person, usually worked for the master blacksmith, and over time could become a journeyman if he was capable enough. Now the self-interest of the guild founders, as I say, were supported by city governments, but each guild maintained its own effective monopoly of its market. It determined the membership, the training criteria, and the products that could be produced, along with their prices, wages, and working conditions. From the earliest times, religious, racial, and ethnic characteristics were used to limit access to guild membership. So they were very particular about who they let in. Once guilds were in place, elected officers out of the guild set the prices for the work that was going to be sold. They maintained quality control over all of the goods and the workmanship by inspections of the shops. They assessed fines, seized goods, and even closed shops if they weren't following the rules of the guild. Guild officers were elected as judges and mediators when disputes arose among guild members and between guild members and customers. As I said, the hierarchy of them was that the poor apprentice oftentimes started out very young as an indentured person and worked for many, many years before he could become a journeyman. And, you know, that was all dependent on, I guess, his standing with the master blacksmith and his standing among all of the other master blacksmiths, because they all had a voice in who would become a journeyman and who would finally become a master. In terms of the journeyman, most people stayed as journeymen. They never really became a master. There was a very limited number of master blacksmiths. And that basically limited the number of shops it could be, and it maintained kind of a continuity in terms of the amount of work that was produced and how they set the pricing. Then there are the subgroups of blacksmiths. And this is important because when you talk about blacksmiths, you have in mind, you know, all of the number of different things that they did, but there was a hierarchy there too. You had the blacksmith who was basically able to do just about everything. And then you had the specialized interests. It's kind of like, you know, having a doctor who's a general practitioner, and then you've got one who's an internist. Well, here you have one that you have blacksmiths who were swordsmiths and armors and specialized in that. And then you had blacksmith versus farriers, and this has gone on since, I guess, horses were first being ridden, but blacksmith could do the farrier work, but farriers actually were also veterinarians. They specialized in taking care of the horse's well-being. So they were very important from the standpoint of exploration. You had to have both blacksmiths and farriers who could take care of the animals for the horses and for the horsemen. Okay, let's go on and move a little bit further. Okay. Not moving. There you go. This is, we're going to talk about anvils first.
You had it muted. Is that you?
Picture there. But that one, it was not in sight. I thought I'd move to this one.
It's them, not you.
Yeah.
I apologize, everyone. You get hooked up here. We had to shift computers. I started talking about the meteorites that were used as anvils back in the 17 and 1800s. This one, the Tucson ring meteorite, or as it is called, it was called the signet or the ring signet. ANSA, or the Irwin-Ansa meteorite at various times. The other mass is called the Carlton meteorite. And both of these are in the Smithsonian Institution. They were actually used as anvils. And here's a rendering of what was done. The first written description of the ring anvil was made in 1845. It was written by a Spanish official named Jose Velasco, who talked about the state of Sonora, entitled, or he wrote a treatise on it, entitled "The Mines of Iron, Lead, Copper, and Quicksilver." He described the mountain pass known today as Box Canyon within the Sierra de la Madeira range, now the Santa Rita Mountains. The pass is located between Tucson and Tubac and contained many large masses of pure iron lying at the foot of the mountains. He wrote of a medium-sized mass that was taken to Tucson, a journey of over 30 rugged miles, where it had resided for many years before 1845, serving as anvil for the armorer in the garrison blacksmith. So this picture, what you're seeing, as I said, is a depiction of the ring anvil being used. Now, the other anvils that are typical of the Spanish are these four. And if you can imagine having to move things that are heavy by an ox cart or one of the old types of Spanish carts, they couldn't be terribly big. So what you're seeing are relatively small anvils. The bigornia and the bigornetta are not terribly large. I think the bigornetta, I own one, and I'll show you a picture of it here in a second, weighs about 30 pounds. It's primarily an armorer's anvil. The bigornia is a bigger anvil for more general use. And the Bigornia de Blanco is smaller of the same thing, although I'll show you a picture here in a second of one that's fairly large and actually was used quite a bit. And then you have the little tiny small anvils, which were just used for doing small work and were very portable. And so here's the, it's called a Catalan anvil, Bigornia. The reason they're called Catalan anvils is that what they really were for is, or what made for was the Catalan forges, and we'll talk a little bit about those. The Catalan Forge was a primary source of both iron and tools for Spain. And so that's why most of these are labeled as Catalan. Now, I skipped over this one. This is two of the anvils from the Frank Turley collection. And as I say, these aren't terribly large. I'd say these probably weigh in the 40 to 50 pound range. But they were certainly suitable for doing everything that you normally have a blacksmith do back in the days when they were necessary. And you can see the rough design and how they were made. Actually, they were used quite a bit. So this is a typical colonial style anvil. This was typical of all that were found across Europe. This is my own anvil, personal anvil. It was made in England, in Sheffield, England, right after the Revolutionary War. And they were used as a ballast in ships, as were the Spanish anvils and any of the metalwork. They were shipped over they were shipped in the bottom of ships and used as ballast to weight the ship down while it was going across the ocean. This anvil that I've got weighs about 100 pounds, and it's a fairly good sized colonial anvil. This is a picture of a original European big ornetta, which is, this is one of mine that I picked up from an estate off the East Coast. I picked up two of them. There's no way to really determine where they were from. They weren't made here in the United States. They had to come from Europe because these were typical armorers' anvils. They were used by armorers for making, the different types of armor that the knights wore at the time. Let's see if I'm forgetting anything here. Next, I'll show you a picture of some hammers. These are colonial type hammers. Now, most of the pictures that I'm going to be discussing from now on come out of the Mark Simmons and Turley book on Southwestern colonial ironwork. I don't know if you guys can see a picture of that, but it's a fantastic reference book for looking at these types of products. Just a second here. And this gives you some idea of the different styles of hammers that were used by the colonial blacksmiths. So as going from left to right, you can probably read that down at the bottom, but you have the farrier's turning hammers, which are ones that look like a kind of a rainbow effect on a handle, going all the way across to, on the right-hand side, which were the cross-peen hammers, which are pretty typical of nowadays types of hammers that even blacksmiths still use. So this is just give you some idea of what they had, what they were using. The top picture on this is a hammer that was from Las Trampas, New Mexico. And you can see it's a fairly small little hammer, weighs about 1.5 pounds, along with a set of tongs. It'd be typical of what a blacksmith would have. It's good to remember too that I'm not doing things.
Just get somebody in.
Oh, okay. A typical blacksmith, though, would make almost all of his tools. As long as he had a hammer an anvil, and a forge, he could pretty much make whatever he needed. And so a lot of what you see are very rustic in terms of the tongs, for example. This is another type of blacksmithing hammer. They call it a Doghood hammer, and it's still commonly used throughout the world by other blacksmiths. This set is a file maker's tool set, and they would use the hammer to pound on the little chisel at the bottom to cut lines into a piece of metal that they would use for making the file.
Should be okay.
Okay. Excuse the technical interruptions, which I don't have any technical ability at all. This is a typical current type of hammer, which a friend of mine that's a blacksmith, his name is Elmer Rouge, made for me. And it's about a 2-pound hammer. And a lot of people talk about the different sizes of hammers and the importance. What I have found, and I think most blacksmiths that actually work in this field find, is that heavier hammers really aren't an advantage. What they do is they tend to wear you out. So a smaller hammer, you know, more than probably a 2.5-pound hammer is more than enough for doing almost any kind of work that you want. Any other type, any heavier hammer, as I say, tends to wear you out, and you really can't get as much done. You can move a small hammer faster, and when the metal's hot, that's important. Big heavy hammer, when the metal's hot, you can only hit it a few times. You may make more of an impression on the metal with a heavier hammer, but you're not going to be able to do as much work. And as I say, most of the tools that a blacksmith makes that he makes himself. And so these are representatives of all the types of handmade tongs that blacksmiths would have. I can't say it's all of them, because even in my shop, I've probably got several hundred different kinds of tongs that are made for different tasks, for handling different kinds of steel, different shapes of steel, from very small to very large, or from moving them in and out of a fire fairly quickly. Now, the other thing that colonial blacksmiths needed was a forge. And so this is actually a recreation of what they call an 18th century colonial forge, colonial style forge. But really, this would be very similar to what early colonial blacksmiths needed and to use. They had to have some kind of a setup where they could have air that was moved through and into the forge to heat the coal. So I'll go back and forth on this. You can see how the hoses coming in on the side actually power the fire in the forge itself. So you use these big bellows that are on the left-hand side to move the air. That would heat the metal, heat the coal or charcoal. Most of them, they were using charcoal at the time because they hadn't really established any coal deposits. And if they were on a move, the only thing they had were wood. So they used charcoal primarily as they were doing their work. Now, talk a little bit about the Iron Age. Really, the Iron Age started across Europe from about 1200 BC to 600 BC, depending on the location. What they were looking at is processes for producing iron, which probably were byproducts of the copper and bronze ages. You didn't need as much heat, the temperature wasn't as high, so they probably had some materials that were rich in iron at the same time they were working on copper and brass. And as kind of a byproduct at the bottom, they found this other metal, which turned out to be iron. And then they slowly developed different ways of making iron. So this is called the Bloomery. This is very typical. It's still found in a lot of countries around the world, particularly in Africa, in some parts of Asia. they use a bloomery for smelting iron from raw ore. And what you do is you're feeding in iron and the charcoal that you're going to be heating, and in a very thick-walled type of a forge. They usually run these for 10 to 20 hours to get what they call a bloom out of it. And the bloom is actually the slag that's created from the raw ore. It's impure iron. It's usually just a giant bundle of or mass of kind of a black material. Later on, they developed what's called the Catalan Forge, and this was Spain's real introduction to high quality steel. The Catalan Forge is just a giant type of bloomery. And what you have here is you're feeding in charcoal and fine ore from the top, and you've got fine ore lining one side of it. You keep running the hot air through the tray and it's melting the iron ore, and it's sagging down into the bottom so that at the end you get what's called a bloom. And so at the end, what you're doing is you have people that are working to remove the big pile of iron from the iron slag, I should say, from the bottom of the bloomery. The way they work this was while it's still hot, then they would pound it with hammers to remove the impurities. And that's where you get the term wrought iron. Wrought means that it's just been worked very hard, and you get a fairly good quality of wrought iron out of it. And in fact, even in England, they were still using this type of a process to make anvils up into the early 1900s. That little anvil that I showed you of mine came from a place called Mousehole Forge in Sheffield, England. And they used wrought iron that they produced themselves right there on the site to make their anvils. And they covered the top of it then with a piece of real high quality steel called crucible steel. The Catalan Forge that we were talking about at first is actually, what was able to produce higher quality types of bloom than most of the other ones. The problem for Spain was that it was widely copied. It started being copied across all of Europe. And while for a time, Spain kind of ruled and controlled the iron industry across Europe, but as others came in and others developed in Germany and France, and even in England, we started seeing competition. And so what Spain did was they implemented a very monopolistic type of process of controlling their iron distribution. Anything that was related to iron, or anything that was related to the colonial expansion had to use only Spanish iron. And so that limited really the amount of iron that was able to go to other parts of the world. The other thing that they developed as they were working was in Toledo. They were able to develop a process which was develop the highest quality steel of anywhere in the world at the time. And for centuries, when the success of a fight depended on not only the ability of the fighter, but also the quality of his tools, then Toledo's steel was the exceptional steel where some of the finest weapons in the world were made. Their extraordinary hardness made each of these swords an invincible force in the hands of an expert swordsman. All European armies knew superior quality of Toledo steel, and many great warriors relied on sabers only from Toledo. Their origin comes back basically from ancient Spanish customs more than 2,000 years ago. In the 5th century BC, Iberian blacksmiths had already forged swords known as a falcata. The one at the top is similar to a falcata, I should say, which had iron encased with a special design encased in both hard and soft steel. Actually, because of the fame of these swords, Hannibal chose them for his army, and Roman legions, after they were defeated by those weapons, adopted them later and supplied their centurions with the dreaded Toledo steel blades. In other parts of the world, the perfection of the Toledo steel, the others tried to reproduce the Toledo steel, but most failed. You may have heard of Damascus steel, which was very high quality steel, but it was unfortunately too hard, so that you couldn't make a real long sword out of it. It was too easy to be broken. Even Japanese swords, which are known for their high quality Damascus steel, still weren't of the same quality. And in fact, Japanese artisans traveled to Spain to learn how to do the Spanish types of steel techniques. Swedish steel, which is also a really, really high quality steel at the time, was made by taking soft steel from a bloom and heating it in a furnace to 650 degrees, along with animal horns and hair and leaves, which put carbon into it and gave it the higher quality, made it better types of steel for use in their tools. There was also good quality steel produced in Germany and France, as I mentioned earlier. The internal structure of Toledo steel and the mystery of its fabrication were a secret well into the 20th century, when they were finally able to be analyzed, and it became apparent that what was happening is they had figured out a way to use both high quality hard steel and high quality soft steel and wrap them together so that you get the best qualities of both. But it required
This is
very,
about
very
blacksmithing
the temperatures
and
and also the timing.
the high quality of Toledo steel swords.
So that gives you some idea of what was going on with steel and why it was so important for the monarchy to be able to control its production at the time. So here we go into the colonization of the New World, and I'll try to move along and see we're kind of getting slowed down, or we have gotten slowed down a little bit. The start of the blacksmith industry really in the New World started in about 1519 with Cortez, when he directed blacksmiths that had accompanied him to make a scale for weighing all of the gold and silver riches that Montezuma was giving him. Montezuma basically had given him gifts, and Cortez was, very generous at the time and worked with him. But after a short period of time, he put Montezuma into chains and shackles and took over the Aztec city of, at the time, Tenochtitlan, or Mexico City. Cortez ordered the two blacksmiths who had accompanied him at Veracruz to hasten to join him, because what he wanted to build some brigantines that he could sail around the lake which surrounds Mexico City. And so the blacksmiths stripped the ships of their metal. They forged chains for the brigantines that Cortez wanted, and they came up and met him in Mexico City and actually helped build and help do the construction on the ships that then he sailed around the lake with. The blacksmith's normal duties, though, were tool making, shackles and chains for slaves, because that's what they were doing with all of the New World indigenous people, the shoeing of horses, and primarily weapons and armor. They also made branding irons for marking the slaves, but those were later outlawed. As I said before, all of the metal iron was required to be shipped from Spain, which severely limited the work of the blacksmiths. Iron and steel had to be continually reused, and anything that came over on ships was stripped off of it as much as they could, because they couldn't do any exploration without having horseshoes. And the horseshoes would wear out because the most of the iron, this wrought iron, is fairly soft and it wore out fairly quickly. There was iron ore in the New World, in New Spain, but because of the prohibition against development of smelters by the monarchy, they never did do it. The other reason, though, is they were really looking for gold and silver, and so smelting of those particular precious metals was much more important to everybody than working on iron. So again, most of the things that were the iron goods first came over as ready-made goods. What's interesting, though, is it caught on fairly quickly that Spain wasn't able to provide as much iron as was necessary. And so there were a lot of ships from other countries that would meet the Spanish ships or meet them before they left port and transfer loads of iron so that the shipmasters could sell the iron when they got to the New World. After 1524, then you started seeing the movement of a lot of the blacksmiths and others as colonists were coming into the country. As I said, the Catalan Forge process was basically being copied all over Europe at the time. And as I've already talked a little bit about all of this. Let me go back. Move too quickly. To show you how the limitation on iron was, I don't know if you can read this, so I'll read it to you. That iron tools for cultivating and plowing the land are especially needed. In particular, iron for horseshoes, for without it, it's not possible to make any punitive expedition, as the enemy lives in rough mountains country and on stony mesas, but no iron has been sent since the year 1628. Consequently, we were perishing without a pound of iron or a plow. For the love of God, Your Excellency, do us a favor in charity to order this assistance be sent. This was a report to the Viceroy by the Toledo of Santa Fe in 1639. So for 11 years, they never got any iron. They had to reuse everything that they had. And it says at the bottom, it's ironic iron was so precious it's ironic to think of iron as a precious metal. However, the production of iron for tools and everyday objects was a monopoly controlled by Spain until Mexican independence in 1821. Iron was so precious in Spanish colonial New Mexico, scraps of worn out iron tools were hoarded, so amounts could be saved to be reworked into horseshoes and a variety of tools. Such collections appear again and again in wills and inventories of all classes of early New Mexicans. So in 1540 and through 1542, Coronado led an army in search of the southern cities of Sabo. He traveled all across New Mexico, Texas, and into Kansas, but obviously it was fruitless. You have to remember that Spain also required many of these explorers to fund these kinds of expeditions themselves. The Spanish monarchy did put some into it with an expectation they were going to get something back out of it. But for the most part, these explorers actually did most of the work themselves and paid for it themselves. So the dilemma that you see here is they came over and a lot of them went bust. They really weren't able to get a lot of the things. But I think the expectation was there because they had been so successful when they first got into Mexico and raided the Aztec hordes of riches. They came out with a lot of very valuable resources. There were lots of different expeditions. I'm only going to mention these two because that just shows what was going on at the time while they were trying to find more of the riches. This is a couple of Spanish colonial horseshoes, and you can see how difficult it was for them to work these. Now, if a blacksmith is going to make these, he's going to use a fairly heavy piece of iron and be able to pound it out so that they could be attached to the horse's hooves. And they were trying to protect as much of the horse's hooves as they can with as thick a piece of iron, because this is really fairly soft iron and it wouldn't last terribly long. You can see that one of them has a mark, a touch mark of whoever the blacksmith was at the time that made it. So we get into Oñate's expedition in 1598 when he brought 400 settlers into the upper Rio Grande from Chihuahua. What he did was he was bringing in permanent settlers, and they first established work around Santo Domingo and then moved up to San Juan Pueblo, and right where the Chama and Rio Grande meet, the Rio Chama is the city of Espanola. So that's about where Oñate made his first settlement. He did carry quite a bit of blacksmithing equipment, and at least 2 individuals that were named in the book accompanying for smithing work. The Franciscan and Jesuit monks actually controlled much of the distribution and use of iron in the borderland provinces. What they were doing is they wanted the iron to be used primarily for religious purposes. And so anything that wasn't going from the military requirements was stripped off and used for religion. That made it kind of hard to do other things such as plows and knives and hammers and nails. Nails were probably the most common thing needed by people in the New World. And that was one of the more difficult things to get at the time. Oñate had been instructed by the king to teach the Indians a way of working and learning the trades so they could apply themselves to direct others. And colonial blacksmiths did work with the native people, teaching them the crafts. This is a lithograph by some of the explorers in the Sitgraves expedition. And this is from Zuni Pueblo, and Zuni actually became pretty famous in the New World for the quality of the workmanship that they were able to do. This is a little list of some of the Oñate's tools. Give you an idea of what he brought in. It doesn't mention in here, though, that there were many, many pounds of nails. And I did find a different reference to where the amount of nails that was brought in equaled almost everything else that was brought over, because nails were the most important thing they needed for the settlements at the time. Okay, so in 1680, the Native American people got fed up with the Spanish. They've been horrible to the native peoples. Hanging, whipping, dismemberment, cutting off toes and things. And so the Indian leader Pope worked with all the other Pueblos and the Apaches and developed a way of synchronizing an attack on the Spaniards. So in 1680, the uprising occurred. They killed 400 Spanish, including 35 priests, and drove the rest of them out of New Mexico for the next 12 years. When the Spanish did return, they came back with a kind of a deference to the Native American peoples and spent more time working with them in all fairness so that they would be treated more fairly. One of the really important aspects for New Mexico was the development of the Sena family, which was a hierarchy of blacksmiths that lived in Santa Fe. And I actually jumped a couple of slides here. So in 1693, a caravan arrived in El Paso from Chihuahua, led by De Vargas. In that caravan was a 9-year-old boy, Bernardo de Sena, who was an orphan. They called him a foundling from Mexico City. He was sort of adopted by some people who moved him with them up to a ranch around Poake. At the age of 18, Bernardo moved to Santa Fe and married a woman, Tomaso Gonzalez. And there he started as a blacksmith. So it's really pretty impressive what Bernardo was able to do. From the time of his marriage until his death, Bernardo lived in Santa Fe, where he acquired considerable property. He, including the plaza, he actually owned the plaza, which now bears his name. And he was Santa Fe's most respected citizen. I'm sorry, my mouth is beginning to dry out. In church matters, he was instrumental in gathering funds for the restoration of the San Miguel Chapel. He was a mayor domo of the Conquistadora Confraternary through most of his adult life, and at the same time serving as a handler of money and property for the Franciscans, who mourned his passing in 1765. He was buried in the chapel of San Miguel. The Sena family bequeathed all of his tools to his son Tomas, and Tomas actually started the hierarchy of all of his offspring. He inherited all of the tools, but when he passed away 50 years later, the forge and inventory equipment went on to become part of the rest of the blacksmithing family. One of the things that Frank Turley found when he was being a conservator for the museum was the Sena family bellows, which, as you remember the picture I showed you earlier of the foundry in Tucson, look at the similarity. This is basically the same type of a thing, which would have been stood on its side and work to put air into it. One of the Sena grandsons, Ramon Sena, who was smithing in Santa Fe in the 1830s, was hired by the Navajos, who wanted to learn ironworking so that they could make their own horse bits, and hired him to come to a camp located north of the present-day Grants. Sena went with another one of the smiths named Jose Castillo and taught the craft to the Indians. As the two men were preparing to leave and return home, word reached them that the other Navajos had gone on the warpath and were about to attack the New Mexicans. To make sure, to make sure that they got home safely, Sena's hosts escorted them back to Santa Fe. That's pretty typical of how the blacksmiths were treated at the time. So as you can see, the last of the long line of Senas was still working in Santa Fe up through the 1920s. Now I want to kind of move on a little more quickly. Everything that I'm about to show you and a lot of the text that I've developed from this presentation came from this book by Frank Turley and Mark Simmons, who are very, very interesting characters in their own right. But if you really want to find out more about Spanish colonial blacksmithing, it's best to get a hold of this book. It's hard to find anymore. It's been out of production for quite a while, and since both Frank and Mark have passed away, it's, there's not going to be any more new ones. I do believe, however, I've heard that there may be a reproduction going to be made. Now I'm just going to go quickly through some of the tools that the blacksmiths made in New Mexico. These are various axe heads, and you can see by looking at the bottom, and you can kind of see how these were made. They were basically a flat piece of metal which was folded around a round billet and in the shape, and then pounded into the shape of an axe head. That's not hard to do, but then when you get in some of this more innate stuff, this is a little bit more difficult. Like these are Spanish buckles used primarily for horses. You have Spanish branding irons. They made brush hooks and scythes. This is a chandelier that's in the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe. You can see it's a holding candles. So it's just a candelabra chandelier. Here's where a lot of the iron went, though. into churchyard decorations and things for the church itself. You can see the amount of iron that was used in these types of decorations. So everything else had to be reused or if it wasn't brought over new. These are axe heads, large types of axe heads. Again, you can see in the picture of on the right-hand side, how the eyes were made, and then the metal was forge welded together with a good quality piece of steel put in the bottom to be able to sharpen so that it would hold an edge. Here you've got the plow points that the Spanish blacksmiths made. And finally, these are fire strikers. Actually, what you do is you take one of these, and I make these when I'm doing work here, showing people the stuff at Casa San Ysidro. What you do is you shape the iron like that, and then you strike it against a hard rock like a piece of agate, and you get a spark from it. I'm sorry?
I think you skipped over the spurs.
Oh, the spurs, yeah. Here's one that you can imagine the poor horses that had to be ridden with these types of. The Spanish really didn't care much for what the horses felt. They just wanted to make sure they got going and were in control. So, but these were made by blacksmiths just for the horses themselves. Now, I did want to talk a little bit about Bart Simmons and Frank Turley, and I'll do it real quickly. Frank Turley was a blacksmith here in New Mexico. He started the oldest blacksmith. Well, he started a blacksmithing school back in 1970. And he just passed away last year from COVID, unfortunately. But he had the oldest blacksmithing school in the United States, and he was honored by the Artist Blacksmith Association of North America. They had a big party for him. I attended. Frank's an old friend of mine, and he signed the book that I have of his. And he's been sorely missed. He was, even to the very end, he had a great sense of humor, and it was a wonderful person to talk to. Mark Simmons also was very much of an individual. For years, he worked on the history of New Mexico, and he wrote over 45 books that talked about New Mexico, and his books are still for sale. You can find copies of them on ABE and Amazon. He collected numerous examples of Spanish ironwork, and the pictures which are included in a lot of his books are from his collection. He wrote for the Santa Fe New Mexican a column called Trail Dust for over 16 years. And he's called the Dean of New Mexico's history. So if you really want to find out more about New Mexico blacksmithing and ironwork, look to those two authors for more information, particularly Mark Simmons, but also this book by Simmons and Turley, Spanish Colonial Ironwork, is a wonderful, wonderful reference book. So I guess that's where we're at.
Yeah, any questions for Dave? So we have a chat too. Oh, Mark and Frank installed the bars on the windows. I did not know that. Kind of religious items were made of iron, bells.
Well, they were actually crosses, bells, candlesticks. When they had better quality iron, or I'm sorry, better quality metals, they made them out of gold or silver, but a lot of them were iron at the time. And unfortunately, as some of the missions fell apart, the iron was stripped off and used for other things. So you don't find a lot of colonial ironwork that's pre-1821, when, once 1821 came along and Mexico declared its independence from Spain, then you saw a lot of what was going on. So this kind of also leads to the question that Kathleen Killorn asked: what years or period did Spain control iron? Really, it was up until 1821 they controlled all of the iron that came into the New World. But and in fact, the same is true in California. the first big Catalan Forge was built in one of the missions in California, and it was built in right after 1821.
I have a question. This is Joe Morris. You mentioned at the beginning that the iron, it comes from copper and the remnants of copper and another metal, I don't remember which. And but then why couldn't, and we have a lot of, in New Mexico, there are quite a few copper mines. Why couldn't they forge the iron from them?
Well, no, it was a byproduct. It just so happened that the iron that they found when they were doing the smelting of copper and brass, it just happened to show up. It wasn't that it was a part of the copper and the brass. It just happened that they had iron ore in probably the smelter that they were making, and so as it burned up, you got some iron that was hot enough to be melted and actually come out the bottom. Yeah, we do, but we also have a lot of iron in both Arizona and New Mexico, and particularly in the northern parts of Mexico itself. There's huge deposits of iron, but there are around Tucson, as I mentioned earlier, large deposits of iron that they never could do anything with until the Spanish released a hold on the smelting of iron. Does that help?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Catherine, you've asked some really good questions. Yeah, your comment about the monarchy created a shortage of iron by outlawing smelters was amazing. It was. It's sort of hard to believe that Spain would have been, or at least the monarchy would have been so controlling that they wouldn't have allowed more and more iron to come across. And particularly because you're going to use it for the ballast in their ships, why not send it over? And so that's why, other countries were meeting up with Spanish ships and transferring iron from their ships to be sold in the New World, selling it to the captains of the Spanish ships who could then turn around and resell it. But there still was just not nearly enough iron. The other thing is that Mexico City actually kind of put a stranglehold on any iron that was coming north. If you go and do a little search on Spanish iron in Mexico City, during the colonization, they built incredible architectural metalwork throughout Mexico City. So a lot of the metal actually that came into the New World wound up being stocked right there in Mexico City and used for the development of that city's architectural beauty. And some of the stuff there is just phenomenal. They had a whole street of the Herreros, the blacksmiths, that did nothing but that kind of architectural work through the 1600s and 1700s. And whereas in New Mexico, once it got past El Paso, there was very little that came into the rest of New Mexico. And so there's very little remnants of good architectural type of colonial ironwork. Do you have anybody else?
Thank you, Dave. Yeah. Yeah, if Casa is able to recover from the flood soon, we will have Harvest Festival next month. That usually takes place at the last weekend in September. You can see Dave work the forge, and you can also join him through the continuing education class, Blacksmithing Basics. You'll see him actually teach some traditional techniques, and you can work your own metal, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's through the continuing education program at UNM. But unfortunately, the two classes that we've got scheduled for the fall are full. So it's you have to get on a waiting list, but we'll do more classes starting in the spring. And there's been people of all ages that have attended these classes. I had a little woman, a wonderful, hardworking person, 79 years old, who worked for 4 hours, just killed herself making a beautiful little hook. And so, you know, it's a fun process. If you're interested, look at continuing education through UNM.
Yeah, excellent. Otherwise, come see us for free on these programming days. Our next second Saturday will be in October, and that will be with Normal Living, all about crypto Judaism and sort of their secret coming to New Mexico from Spain. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. That's it.